From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is Update One, the club's official podcast. It features newsworthy stories originating from the NPC facilities, as well as broader topics related to journalism, communications, press freedom, and transparency.
I'm Adam Konowe, co-chair of the National Press Club's broadcast podcast team. Joining me is Natalie Jacobsen, fellow club member. She is also author of the new book, Ghost Train. Natalie, welcome to Update One.
Thank you so much.
Let's start with you. You have a background in journalism, which I understand started at the tender age of 13. Tell us about it.
Yes, I've always been into creative writing. And then when I was 13, I was reading the Harry Potter books like a lot of other kids my age. And I actually started writing a lot of long stories about the characters. It was early fan fiction, let's just say it. And my mom thought it was special. So she actually reached out to the newspapers and said, my daughter is writing a lot, and I think she'd be great at a story. And they actually said, yes, let's try. So they gave me an opportunity to write Harry Potter book reviews as they were coming out in middle school and high school. And they also kind of followed my career and supported it early on. So that was my little jump start right into it. And it was a really exciting opportunity that I didn't fully understand at that age. And now I'm very appreciative of it.
And I understand you have a connection to Japan.
Yes, a very strong one. I grew up in Oregon, and there's a lot of Japanese community out there, and University of Oregon, where I went, has the largest Japanese exchange program. So we had a lot of students from Waseda who were there each year, and we had a lot of friends, and it was just such an awesome community. And I was able to take really top level Japanese courses, Japanese history courses. So when a few of my friends were looking to move over there, I thought, well, maybe I could go over there too. Actually, one of my best friends out there is a pop star, and I wound up going with him as his photographer and somewhat creative manager a little bit. So we did a lot of projects out there together before I transitioned into journalism and other kind of areas out there.
Japan has a very different approach to journalism than what many of us are familiar with. So talk about what you saw and the challenges of doing that job there, both as a Westerner and as a woman.
So in many ways, Japan is still a very heavily patriarchal society. So it's something that they actually transformed into during the Meiji era when Ghost Train is set. And today they still have one of the lowest percentages of women in politics and in leadership roles of companies across the country compared to any other country. So it was sometimes difficult for others to see me as someone with credibility, even when I was interviewing them. Sometimes I got retorts of them suggesting like they wanted to talk to someone else or implying I wasn't read up enough. In some cases, stories that were also the most difficult to write are the ones that confront or challenge authority, which is a huge topic also in Ghost Train. They don't have as strong freedom of information laws or protections as we do in the United States. So a story could get killed at any time. If a subject did not want to be written about, you weren't supposed to write about it. So there are a lot of stories that we couldn't pursue. So there are a lot of topics I think are not reported on enough. There are some changes going on. There are those who spearhead it and those who are taking it on and doing some great work. And I found that at Tokyo Weekender, I was able to get a couple of good stories in that did investigative work, but there were some challenges along the way.
And so how did the investigative journalism and the other assignments that you did there inform your decision to become an author?
There was a wealth of information and knowledge I just absorbed while writing these stories and all these incredible people that I was meeting. And I really wanted to compile all of my knowledge and experiences in one place. Sure, I have a portfolio of articles and journalism pieces and assignments, but I wanted it to be in a book format. I wanted to really have a way to just extract all this experience and say like, okay, I need to put this somewhere. And I wanted a creative outlet to do it.
So Ghost Train is a historical fantasy novel. It's set in 19th century Japan. Why that genre and why that period?
It was a complicated journey. I kind of joke with others and say Ghost Train has every genre except for romance in it. it was first going to be a pure historical fiction novel. But the thing about Japan is their folklore has a lot of ghosts and demons, and they talk about them in a magical realism sense, like in Latin American countries. They see demons and ghosts almost as a fact of life. And so they may not think anything of it. It may be speculative fiction at most, but in the Western countries, here in the United States, you mentioned demon or ghost, and that automatically is paranormal or fantasy. So hence the historical fantasy title, whereas maybe in some other countries it still is maybe a little bit of historical fiction. So it's very interesting how different cultures will perceive things differently. They'll just accept some things as a fact of life, whereas others will not. So that's kind of why I chose that genre, make it a little bit more palatable for Americans and Westerners to say, okay, yeah, no, ghosts and demons, that's fantasy. But that time period in 19th century Japan is one of the most pivotal in their history. They had just gone from an isolation period of 300 years with borders closed to all countries, all trade, all technology, everything. They were in the medieval feudal era. Then Meiji took over, he opened the borders, and in just a few years, the country transformed into a modern, competitive country in the world. They got technology like trains, electricity, gas, Western education, Western philosophy, Westernized government, all in just a decade. So this country underwent a huge overhaul and social upheaval. So it's a kind of a chaotic time period that I wanted to explore a little bit more of what the mindset of a civilian might have been like during that time.
You began writing this book 14 years ago. So what prompted you in 2020? And then I guess more importantly, why the long gestation period?
So in 2010, I was still a student at University of Oregon, and I was taking a history class about Japanese culture, and I was learning about the folklore that came out of this tumultuous time period because people were overwhelmed with this new information, but they couldn't understand it. They didn't have the context. There wasn't social media. There wasn't internet. They were getting piecemeal of these things, and they were filling in gaps with folklore, things that were unexplainable to them. New technologies were controlled by demons to them. It was brand new and it was scary. So I was fascinated, and I heard about a phenomenon called ghost trains. It's similar now, we understand, to truck drivers who drive for long hours and they start to hallucinate. They see cars that don't exist. They see other trucks. They see animals. And the same thing happened with conductors in the rather late 1800s Japan. They were driving for long hours and they would see phantom trains. And that fascinated me to begin about writing about those. But then I discovered that as a student, I was 20 years old and I felt I was woefully unprepared to really take on the project and do it justice to what I wanted to do. And that's when I finished school, I moved to Japan, and I started to digest all these stories and the culture, meet more people. And then finally, during the pandemic in 2020, I felt, okay, I'm still holding on to this story. And now I feel a little bit more equipped, both skillfully as a writer and then also with the knowledge of Japanese culture up close.
So talk about that challenge of getting into the heads of characters that are not only fictional, but quite frankly, look nothing like you.
That is a challenge. I will admit I don't take an assignment like this lightly. I approached it from a very journalistic perspective. I don't only in my journalism or in fiction write about white American women in their mid-30s. That's not what my community looks like. That's not what our world looks like. If we only were allowed as journalists to write about people who look like us, the news would be extremely skewed. We would not know really the truth of what's going on anywhere in the world. That would be a very different world, especially with information sharing. But in order for me to also respect and make sure I got the culture right, I actually interviewed a lot of historians and subject matter experts, just like I would in a journalism piece. I read over 3,000 documents, firsthand accounts, historical documents, to get really the details of the historical context right. And then I spoke to a lot of friends who had relatives still alive from the Meiji era. They were able to impart real superstitions and family stories to me, and I sent my work to a lot of different Japanese historians and friends as well to make sure that it was still an accurate reflection of the culture and their perspectives. Of course, there are still going to be some liberties taken. It's not a monolith country or culture. People will probably have different opinions, and I welcome those, and I'm hoping to have more conversations about this.
Your teenage main character, Maru Hosokawa, must overcome her own anxieties to confront authority as Japan was becoming, as you talked about, more industrialized and later more westernized as well. What parallels do you draw with your own experiences living there?
So Japan is in a unique position where it is still experiencing a little bit of isolation anxiety. They had it for so long, and this change was so fast, and now Japan is still rapidly changing today. They are ahead of us in some ways in technology, and some ways behind us. They still use a fax machine as their primary way of communication. So there are still some growing pains, especially as more foreigners are trying to come into Japan. They actually have very tense immigration discussions and very strict rules about how many can enter a year. So I was kind of seeing these conversations happening while I was living there about how many rights do foreigners have? Can they ever be seen as a true Japanese resident? Foreigners who live there for decades are still not seen as a Japanese resident, even if it's on their little card. Like they have a resident card, they're not seen as a resident by others. So I definitely experienced a lot of that isolation, or that you're an imposter, you're a guest here, when are you going home type of question that I would get quite a lot. And with my journalism experience, and you can't write about authority in a negative way, and you got pushback on who you are, and like, oh, you're a woman, you can't talk about this, I don't want to talk to you. I felt that I needed Maru to overcome a lot of these anxieties and understand what was happening to her country. And she was seeing in real time her rights be taken away, and what happens when foreigners come in too. And there was a fear, there was her anxiety, and a little bit of grief in there too, because it's mourning a loss of what used to be, and it's dealing with, well, this is happening, and how do we go from here?
You refer to this book as, quote, my love letter to Japan. Might there be a sequel?
I'm hoping so. When I originally wrote this story, it was 400,000 words. And this first book, people will see, is only 110,000 words. So yes, there are 2 sequels that are already written. So if sales go well enough, my publisher has expressed interest in pursuing the sequels. There is a lot more to tell about this era and Maru's journey.
Well, we wish you the best of luck. And Natalie, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Natalie Jacobsen is author of Ghost Train for Update One in Washington. I'm Adam Konowe.
You have been listening to Update One, the official podcast of the National Press Club, the world's leading professional organization for journalists and a vigorous advocate of press freedom worldwide. If you have any questions or comments about Update One, send an email to updateonepodcast@gmail.com.